A few years ago, I took a job as a janitor at an old police station. It was mostly decommissioned, only used as storage for old case files and evidence that hadn't been processed yet. Occasionally, a couple of detectives would drop by to sift through records, but for the most part, it was empty. I worked the midnight shift, which didn't bother me at first. The station was quiet, and I had plenty of time to myself. But about 2 weeks in, things started to feel off. One night, as I was cleaning the main office, I heard a noise coming from the holding cells in the back. It sounded like someone tapping on metal. I figured it was a rat or something, so I grabbed a broom and headed back to check it out. When I got to the holding area, the tapping stopped. The cells were empty, just as they had been since the station closed. I shrugged it off and went back to work. But the next night it happened again. This time the sound was louder, like someone dragging something metal along the bars. It echoed down the hallway, sending a chill up my spine. I called out, hoping it was just a stray detective or maybe even a prank, but no one answered. I decided to ignore it and finish my shift as quickly as possible. But as I was mopping the hallway later, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. One of the cell doors was ajar. They were supposed to be locked at all times. I knew for a fact it had been closed the night before. I didn't report it. I told myself that it was nothing. Maybe a maintenance worker had been through. But deep down, I felt like something wasn't right. The tapping continued every night after that. Sometimes it was faint, almost like it was trying not to be heard. Other times it was aggressive, loud enough to make me jump. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to go through some of the old case files in the evidence room. Just to see if there was anything strange about the station's history. It didn't take long to find something unsettling. One file stood out. An old folder labeled Case 119, Unresolved. Inside were reports about an inmate who had died in one of the cells decades ago. According to the records, the man had been arrested for a string of violent crimes, but he never made it to trial. The file didn't say how he died. There were no details, no autopsy report, just a vague note about unexplained circumstances. But what really got to me was a photograph of the cell he'd been held in. It was the same one that I'd found open. That night, I couldn't focus on my work. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the cells. It was closer, like it was following me. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard a voice, low and hoarse. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, gripping my broom tightly. I turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder. "Get out." I didn't need to be told twice. I left my equipment where it was and ran out of the station. I didn't go back to work the next night. In fact, I quit without even collecting my last paycheck. A few months later, I heard that the station had been fully decommissioned. They were demolishing it to make way for a new office building. Part of me wonders if tearing it down will put whatever's in there to rest, but another part of me is terrified that it won't, that whatever's haunting that station might find somewhere else to go. I still hear that voice in my dreams sometimes, telling me to leave, and I wake up, grateful that I did. A few months ago, I picked up a temporary security job at an old, decommissioned police station. It was only supposed to be for a few weeks while the city decided what to do with the building. My job was simple: make sure no one broke in, check the cameras, and lock up after my shift. The station had been shut down for years, but walking through it, you'd think it was left in a hurry. Desks were still cluttered with old paperwork. Evidence lockers were untouched, and there was even a coffee mug left on one of the desks. On my third night, I started to notice small things that didn't add up. First, one of the old holding cell doors was open. I was certain it had been locked the night before. I even remembered checking it. I locked it again and told myself I'd double-check the cameras later. The next night, as I was making my rounds, I heard a faint noise coming from one of the back offices. It sounded like shuffling papers. At first, I thought someone had broken in, so I radioed the station supervisor and went to investigate. The room was empty, but a single file folder was lying open on the desk. It wasn't there when I had walked through earlier. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. It was an old arrest record for someone named Paul Mathers. The details were blurry. I couldn't make sense of why his name stuck out to me. The cameras didn't show anything unusual that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the building. A week later, on what was supposed to be my last shift, things escalated. The cell door that I'd locked twice was open again. This time, the door was swinging slightly, creaking with the movement. I decided to check the cameras immediately. When I replayed the footage, I froze. At around 2:13 a.m., the door opened on its own. No one was near it. I was starting to panic, but I convinced myself to finish my patrol. I walked back toward the holding cells, determined to lock the door one last time. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I stopped and called out, "Is someone there?" There was no answer, but the footsteps continued. I followed the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand, until it led me to one of the interview rooms. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and saw a chair sitting in the middle of the room. On it was a folder, the same one I'd seen before, with Paul Mathers' name on it. I didn't have time to process what was happening because, at that moment, I heard a voice. It was faint but distinct. "Why didn't you stop it?" I turned around, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. The voice came again, louder this time. "You let it happen." I bolted out of the station, not even bothering to lock up. The next morning, I called my supervisor and quit. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I didn't care to try. But a few days later, I couldn't resist looking up the name from the file. Paul Mathers had been a suspect in a missing persons case 20 years ago. He was held at the station for questioning, but was released due to lack of evidence. A week later, the missing person's body was found. The case was never solved, and Mathers disappeared shortly after. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced in that station, but I know one thing. Whatever happened to that missing person left a mark, one that lingers in those empty halls. And for some reason, it felt like whoever, or whatever, was there wanted me to feel guilty for something I didn't even know about. A year ago, I got a job as an overnight clerk at a small-town police station that had been decommissioned for nearly a decade. The department used it to store old case files and evidence, but it was largely abandoned. My role was simple: monitor the security cameras, log any activity, and ensure no one broke in. It was an easy gig, but the atmosphere was eerie. The station still had its original layout, with dim hallways, outdated furniture, and a row of empty holding cells. I usually stayed in the main office, avoiding unnecessary patrols of the dark hallways. On my third week, something strange happened. Around 2 a.m., I noticed one of the cameras near the holding cells was glitching. The screen would flicker, and for a split second, it looked like something moved in the frame. When I rewound the footage, it showed nothing unusual, just the empty corridor. I decided to check it out in person. The air felt heavier as I approached the cells. That's when I noticed one of the cell doors was slightly open. I distinctly remembered it being locked the night before. My heart started pounding, but I convinced myself it must have been left that way by mistake. I closed and locked it, then went back to the office. But later that night, while reviewing more footage, I saw something that froze me in place. In the same camera feed, the cell door was open again, swinging slightly. No one had been there since I locked it. The next night, I was determined to figure out what was going on. I arrived early and double-checked every room and hallway to make sure everything was in order. I locked the cells myself and made a note of it in my log. Around midnight, I heard something unusual. A faint knocking sound coming from the direction of the interrogation rooms. It was slow and deliberate, as if someone was tapping on the glass. I grabbed my flashlight and went to investigate. The rooms were empty, but one of the doors was ajar. On the table inside was a single piece of paper. It wasn't there when I checked earlier. The paper had a name written on it, Michael Carr. I didn't recognize it, but something about seeing that name made me uneasy. When I returned to the office and searched the name in the station's old database, a file popped up. Michael Carr had been arrested decades ago for armed robbery, but had died in custody under mysterious circumstances. According to the report, he had been found unresponsive in one of the holding cells. That cell was the same one I'd found open. The knocking returned, louder this time, echoing down the hall. I turned off the camera monitors, grabbed my keys, and left the station without looking back. The next morning, I called my supervisor and quit. I never told anyone what happened. A few months later, I heard the building had been condemned and was set to be demolished. I thought that would be the end of it, but last week I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written on it. "Why did you leave me?" I don't know how to explain it, and I don't want to, but some nights I still hear that knocking in my dreams, and I wake up wondering if leaving that station was the right choice or if it just made things worse.